I'm Tyler, and this is the AntiSocial Network.
Don't look away. Let the fear wash over you.
Hey, T-Dog. What is up in his house?
Welcome to your number one source of internet oddities.
My life is a living tell.
There's just so much beauty in the world, you know?
Here we host conversations with interesting people across the internet.
The God you believe in is not only not good, that God made a world filled with liberals.
Curse of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains.
You haven't heard of them, but I have.
Perhaps I am cringe, but that makes me free.
Join us every Friday for discussions on culture, entertainment, politics, religion, and whatever happens to catch our fancy that week.
Hell is actually real, and Christianity was right all along. Sorry.
Oh.
The cities are decaying, destroyed by decades of leftist policies. Return to monkey.
You're probably thinking this is some pretty deep stuff, and you're right.
This episode of the AntiSocial Network is brought to you by North Arrow Coffee Company, a veteran-owned company that donates 15% of its proceeds to pro-life groups like Soundview Pregnancy Services and Compass Care Crisis Pregnancy Center in Buffalo, New York. Support the AntiSocial Network and use code AntiSocial10 at checkout to receive 10% off your next purchase of coffee and other coffee-related products. Thank you very much. This week we are joined by Professor John Walton of Wheaton College. As I understand it, he is the professor of Old Testament there. How's your day going?
Going pretty well. Got in early, got some writing done. Good day.
That sounds like a good day so far. It's relatively early, so.
I tend to get in early and get a lot of writing done in those early morning hours.
That's the college professor life, right? I mean, you got to get that in before school, I guess.
Yeah.
So, what did you? As I was told recently that you're starting to you get a couple things going. You have a book on Daniel coming out.
I'm working on a commentary on Daniel for the Erdman's Nikot series, and I'm working with my co-author Aubrey Buster, who's also my colleague here at Wheaton. So we're plugging away on that. Hope to be able to turn in some manuscript to the publisher before the end of the year. It's going to be 2 volumes.
Okay, wow, that's comprehensive. What has your approach been to that?
Just trying to make the best sense of the text that we can, both in terms of some Neo-Babylonian anchors, as well as the Hellenistic audience in which some of the message landed.
Well, there you go. So I think for most people that would be clicking onto this, they're probably familiar with your book, Lost World. How would you describe your work in Old Testament cosmology for people who aren't necessarily familiar with that, and why it's important to understanding the Bible?
Well, we're basically trying to understand how an ancient Israelite would have read the text. We believe that the authority of the text is vested in the communication that God gave through those human instruments, whether authors or editors, and that we have basically insider to insider communication. Israelites writing to Israelites. And we believe that it was comprehensible in that context. And so we're trying to understand how they would have read the text. So I think that that's important, because if we consider the Bible to have authority, which I do, that authority is connected to the understandings of the authors and editors as they wrote.
Could you kind of give us an elevator pitch version of your overall thesis in terms of what that worldview looked like?
Well, basically for Genesis 1, my belief is that it's not really dealing with what we might identify as the scientific origins of the cosmos or the universe. As I understand ancient Israel, they really don't have that material world in their focus. Certainly they would have believed that God manufactured the material world, but the text is not filled with terraforming or things of that sort. It rather focuses on bringing order. Order was the highest value in the ancient world, as far as I can tell, and a lot of people seem to agree with that, ancient Near Eastern scholars. And so the idea that creation would involve establishing order, both in the cosmos and in society, would make sense in that ancient world. And it also makes sense with the Genesis text because so much of what we see there doesn't have to do with material formation. It has to do with order, things like time and space. And so the idea of God ordering the world should also lead to a question of what is he ordering it for? In Genesis 1 book that you mentioned, I talked a lot about what I called functional ontology. That is, that something existed when it had a function. I probably these days prefer the word order. I used that also in that book, but I kind of highlighted the idea of function. But the idea of order is that things function the way they're supposed to, with a role and a purpose in an ordered system. And so when you have function and order involved, you ask, what is the purpose? And I believe that in Genesis 1, the purpose is clarified in that God is creating this space and this order for human beings, but also with the intention of dwelling among them. And so I see day 7 as reflecting God resting, not by relaxing, but in the ancient world, gods rest in temples and they rest on a throne and they rule. And so God's rest is God's rule, and he is ordering the cosmos to function for people under his rule and with his presence being among them. So that's the basic thrust of it, that it's focused on order, not material, and that its purpose is God setting up his own rule and presence in the cosmos. In that sense, it's important because it says it's not talking about science. It's not even giving a material conversation about the age of the earth or about the nature of the cosmos. Its function is on order, not material. And therefore, lots of our scientific questions are deemed anachronistic, not really doing what the text is doing. And that gives us the idea that instead of talking about this as a text of cosmic origins in scientific ways, it's talking about cosmic identity. What is the cosmos? How is it ordered? What is its purpose? And that's just a different kind of thrust to it. So that's a quick summary. Sorry to take so long with that. But
No, I mean, you ask a professor to summarize their thoughts, and they'll give you an hour lecture and as the summary. But because that's the nature of the material. I mean, there's a whole book you wrote in multiple books on this. How does this affect? Does viewing Genesis through this cosmology, affect the truth claims of the Bible? Because the first thing I think a lot of people are going to, people I've read who either who disagree with you, who tend to view that this is it harms our understanding of how people do hermeneutics and how they interpret the Bible nowadays. How does it? Do you feel that it makes the Bible's narrative stronger or weaker, or how do you feel people who think that it makes it weaker?
Well, I certainly believe it makes it stronger. The truth claims of the Bible have to be weighed in terms of what the authors intended to communicate. And that means you have to dip into the ancient world to try to understand the context in which they operated. They were having their own conversations in their own cultural context. And our job to understand the truth claims is to understand what claims the author is making. If the author is not making scientific claims, then we are imposing something foreign on the text when we try to recruit it to our own aims and our own questions. And to me, that's the hermeneutics that reflects respect for authority. If I believe in the authority, which I do, that means that I believe that I'm accountable to the author's intentions. And so I have to read the text in light of that. People talk about reading the Bible literally. Well, reading the Bible literally means reading it exactly as the author intended it to be read. And again, that means we have to understand how they intended it to be read. And so in my mind, if we're pursuing that, it can only strengthen our understanding of the truth claims of the text. And when we're tracking with the authors and understanding the truth claims that they had in mind as they wrote, I don't know what other hermeneutic we would want to use. That's what's going to get us to authority. So, um, yeah, I think that it definitely makes our approach stronger. Um, we have to focus on the questions the text is asking and the answers that it's giving.
Why do you think that there's pushback then if this is if authorial intent is the core driver of how we want to understand this?
Well, I think there's pushback because people have a lot of vested interests in reading the text scientifically. Um, they they have a lot of reason to want to do that, and uh, therefore they're trying to defend that particular view. Uh, that's one side of pushback. Another side of pushback is to say, why are we going to the ancient Near Eastern texts? Those are not authoritative scripture. Those are mythology. They're pagan. Why would you go to those texts? And of course, my answer to that is I go to those texts because texts from the ancient world can give us windows into how people thought in the ancient world, and Israel is part of the ancient world. So if I'm going to try to understand how they're thinking, I have to put them in context. That doesn't mean that they are borrowing the mythology of the ancient world. I would never suggest that. I'm rather suggesting that they're in conversation with the world around them. And if we want to understand their conversation, we need to understand the world around them. It's just like to understand Shakespeare, you'd want to get into Elizabethan England and understand what the issues were then. When we read Augustine, we have to understand that he's just having discussions with the Manichaeans. When you read Irenaeus, you have to understand he's having conversation with the Gnostics. When you read Calvin or Luther, there's conversations with Catholicism. You have to understand the conversations that they're having to understand the perspectives that they're taking up and the points they're making. And the ancient literature of Mesopotamia and Egypt give us that kind of context. And they help us to understand, for instance, that order was the high value. And that's important because every indication is that Israel shared that view. So in that sense, it's not borrowing literature, it's sharing a cultural context.
What about from the more secular side of criticism? Because I know that a lot of the modern criticism of like the John Day and Near Eastern research tends to default to like the opposite extreme of saying of a lot of these Near Eastern stories, they were the sole source of the Old Testament. What do you say to those criticisms?
Well, I think that they're overstating their position. Again, I would see the Israelite authors, if you will, as being in conversation, but that doesn't make them dependent or derived. They are more subversive because they're offering alternative views. Are they aware of the ancient Near Eastern literature? I wouldn't see reason to doubt that or question it. But being aware of it is simply a way of saying they're part of their world. Anybody writing at any time is aware of the literature in general around them, and they're carrying on their conversation in that light. So I think that certainly there is an interaction with the ancient Near Eastern literature. Again, that doesn't make it a derived product. It's a interrelated product, but there's nothing wrong with that, and any literature represents that. So clearly people that are in the broader scholarly world would take issue with my beliefs about the authority of Scripture. I get that. We disagree. But I'm treating the text as authoritative Scripture and interacting with it that way, yet as not derived from, but embedded in that ancient world. So I would feel like they have not proved their case, that Genesis is simply derivative material.
So what should modern Christians take away from that Near Eastern cosmology then from the Old Testament? Because there's these elements in the book that are very anachronistic to us, like the sky dome made of water and these seeming assumption of the flat Earth and the pillars of the Earth. Like, what are we what should we take away from those, knowing that that their cosmology is not scientifically true, but that it's what they believed?
Well, there, even in those people who speak very strongly about inerrancy, they'll talk about the text being inerrant in all that it affirms. That suggests that there are some things the text doesn't affirm. And minimally, that would involve things like reported speech, which, sure, that speech was made. That doesn't mean the person was right, like Job's friends, or even statements of Satan. Okay, so there's things that are not being affirmed as, and this is scriptural teaching, yet it's in there. So how do we differentiate that hermeneutically? I've adopted the distinction between reference and affirmation. Reference is when it's referring to the world in which they live and things that people say, which has to happen. Everything in the text is reference at one level. It's referring to things that are known and common and happened and things like that. But then there's affirmation, which is a smaller set, which are those things that come as scripture. And again, this is a distinction that everybody makes at some level. So I would say that God is communicating into that world, that Israelite world, and he's accommodating himself to that world. That's been a standard in hermeneutics for many centuries, and is part of the way that we understand Scripture, that there is some accommodation in it, and accommodation to the audience and the way the audience thinks. God is not trying to change their cosmology. Doesn't matter. Our cosmology might be wrong on some counts too, that we'll learn more. God wasn't changing their cosmology, and so he communicates to them in the cosmological terms that they understood. He speaks into a culture. But we would not take that cosmology as affirmation, that everybody has to think of a solid dome and a flat earth. That's rather reference because of the audience that he's addressing. So it comes into that distinction between reference and affirmation. In that sense, I don't think that Christians should worry about it. We don't have to worry that the Bible is teaching flat earth. We just say that's accommodation, that's reference, and that's not a truth claim.
I have seen people unironically say that if you don't believe that the earth is flat, then you don't believe in the Bible. But that's an extreme position, even by some of our modern arguments on these sorts of things. How do you, for people who have been zooming out a little, for people who have read your books, how have they said that it's contributed to their faith? Have people said that it's helped them get through stumbling blocks, or have people said that it's been difficult to grapple with these ideas? What has the reaction been like?
I get emails almost every week of people who say that this has given them a better perspective on reading Scripture, has helped them to get through some obstacles, and even ones that have said it's changed my life. I was ready to leave the faith, and this brought me back. So I get that fairly regularly, not only in emails that I receive, but in when I'm at conferences, people come up to me and say those kinds of things regularly. So that's just anecdotal. Of course, I have no idea of percentages or things of that sort. But that's very gratifying that people have found it helpful.
Yeah, I don't know how you'd go about getting a peer-reviewed study on how any individual book has made a dent like that. But reactions are kind of the way you kind of judge something like that, I guess, because obviously you get the controversial, like he's a heretic, bad hermeneutics, and then you got the the more the side that says it's freeing to not have to have this kind of a tight grip on Scripture, and at least in the way people tend to traditionally read it. Do these does trying to approach them this way change the way we have to approach our hermeneutical understandings and methodologies towards Scripture? Because obviously there's always a danger in reading the Bible in ways that come with negative implications, or reading in such a way that it kind of minimizes the text, or you start getting into like the theology that says that Jesus wasn't actually the Messiah and didn't incarnate. Like, how do we build a hermeneutic around this, or incorporate it into our current understanding?
Hermeneutics can always be a problem if you don't formulate them well or if you don't apply them consistently. My hermeneutic is based on the premise of biblical authority and therefore tied to the idea of understanding as best we can what the author's intentions were. And there I'm not talking about his intentions in his mind. I'm not trying to psychoanalyze him or get inside his head. I'm assuming he's an effective communicator and that his communicated intentions can be discerned from the literature. If you don't believe that, then there's no hope of having something called scripture. So in that sense, I'm tethered to the author's intentions as best as I can understand them. That's my hermeneutic. And I apply it consistently as best I can. I think I am applying it consistently. And when you apply a hermeneutic consistently, you're going to rule out certain options. Now, some people find that the hermeneutic I adopt rules out certain options that they like, that they've embraced, and therefore they find my hermeneutic controversial. But I would push back with the question of, okay, so what hermeneutic of authority are you using that allows you to do those things? If you're going to be consistent, there are controls, and if there are controls, there are things that don't fit. And I find that lots of people simply are not committed enough to their hermeneutic to apply it consistently. And so there's going to be controversy because I'm going to find things that are unacceptable, that even though they've been traditionally accepted. So I have a new book called Wisdom for Faithful Reading that lays out principles and practices for Old Testament interpretation and talks about all of these different areas and how this hermeneutic has to be carried through consistently and what the impact of that is, both negatively and positively.
When I, in the lead up to my to the podcast, I talked to a couple of people, and one of my friends asked me to bring up the Church Fathers because he was curious, because he's Orthodox, and he was curious how our understanding of Scripture through them might be affected by this kind of reading, because obviously the Church Fathers of the Orthodox Church have a more strict set of authorities in terms of how they tend to view their hermeneutic. Do you have any thoughts on how how the Church Fathers' interpretations of scriptures kind of fit into this? Because I know that there are people like Origen and Augustine who have more outwardly kind of speculative and allegorical readings on the scripture, but it seems to be from my readings on it seems like they were more kind of what we would consider literalists to some degree.
Some were literalists and some were not. But even when they spoke of literal interpretation, they weren't necessarily doing what we do. Many of the Church Fathers had no access to Hebrew text, no interest in Hebrew text. Certainly they had no access to the ancient Near East. That had been lost by the time of the church. And so they had no access to it, and therefore no desire to reconstruct what that author's intentions might have been in the cultural context. So they could not do what we are trying to do today, language and culture as important. They were not interested in doing what we are doing today because their interests were theological and their hermeneutics were addressed toward their theological questions. They were asking questions about Christology and soteriology. And well, they might. Those were important issues in their days, in the conversations they were having, again, with Gnostics and with the Pelagian debate and the Arian debate and the Manichaeans and all the way through. those are the conversations they're having, and they're theological conversations, and they're trying to address the theology. So they did not have available to them the tools that we have, nor had they really any interest in pursuing the questions that we're pursuing. But I think we also have to be careful when we try to use the church fathers in support of this view or that view in our own modern questions. We have to be careful to read them in their own contexts. Just like I want to read Jeremiah or Samuel or Genesis in its own cultural context, I want to read the church fathers in their cultural context. And we can't necessarily recruit them to the kinds of questions that we're asking, and we can't subsume them into the hermeneutical approaches that we're taking because they were not the ones they were using. And so, again, we have to be careful that we're reading them with integrity. Am I giving interpretations that are not in line with what the church fathers were giving? Of course I am, because I have data that they didn't have. I have questions that they weren't asking, and I'm trying to offer answers in the context of this hermeneutic that is widely accepted today, that we're interested in the author's intentions. So, yes, there are differences, but the differences are not so much theologically controversial, although, of course, you can find all kinds of theological conclusions in the church fathers, depending who you read and what context they have. It's interesting that people will pick out this or that phrase from Augustine or Calvin or Origen or whoever it might be, and totally ignore exactly what they meant by that question and by that answer they were given. So just like some people just grab proof texts from Scripture, people also tend to grab proof texts from the church fathers to say, here, Augustine said this, and so we ought to believe it. Well, look at some of the other things Augustine said, and we don't believe that at all. So I think we have to treat it with a little more care, a little more integrity, a little more nuance than what we often do.
I'll close out my final question with a quick anecdote. So a couple months ago, I was I attended the Concordia Lutheran Choir was in Nashville where I live, and I attended a concert there, and I'd never been to this church before, and I spoke to the presiding reverend after the service, and he asked me like what it would take me to, well, if what would it take for you to join the Missouri Synod? And I asked him very straightforward, like, do I have to believe in what you would consider a literal 6-day creation? And he said, no, we don't abide by what the scientists say. And I, obviously at that point I'm like, okay, I can't, I'm more of my authoritative position on this is that you kind of have to not have your, a tight grip on it. Otherwise you kind of run in circles, and you end up having to spend hundreds of millions of dollars building building museums to explain the science behind all this, and it ends up just kind of being a setback and creating tension. Do you think that a wider understanding of these ideas would kind of relieve some of that tension and would kind of be freeing to help people kind of feel more comfortable in the faith? Because I think that for a lot of people, that tension is there, where if you're not in the church, or if you grew up in some in a fundamentalist Baptist church, and this is the only version of Christianity you've ever known, you have that tension in you where it's like, this reality I was taught does not meet the reality I see in the world. Now, obviously, that's difficult to fully, it's difficult to fully unite that for anyone. But do you think that having this idea set would help kind of smooth out a lot of debates?
Certainly, and many of my readers have found that to be the case. If the text is talking about order, not material, then it's not giving us a scientific perspective. If it's working in the ancient world, they're not talking about biology or astronomy or chemistry or physics or any of those sorts of things. If the 7 days are about this imagery of temple inauguration, then the 7 days have nothing to do with the material age of the earth. And so certainly this resolves some of those tensions in that it says science and the Bible are not talking about the same things here. Science is interested in material origins. The Bible is interested in identity of the cosmos. What is it, and how has God set it up? And so they're just different questions. One of the ways I frame it is that the Bible is interested in agency. God is the one who set it up. It's not interested in mechanisms, how he did it, over what period of time, etc. Science is interested in mechanisms and can't address agency. So in that sense, they're answering different questions. And both are important answers to important questions, but they're not addressing the same kind of thing. So to that extent, if people are convinced of that, then certainly it resolves tension, because they say, I don't have to figure out if they're saying the same thing. I don't have to talk about them as being contradictory. They are compatible. Although science is not talking about the Bible and the Creator, and the Bible is not talking about science and its mechanisms, but they are compatible because even those who adopt an evolutionary model can say, and God is the one who's supervising all of that. He's still the creator, even in that kind of model. So in that sense, it opens up space for people who are inclined to go those kinds of directions.
Out of curiosity, do you abide by the evolutionary model, or what is your, personal speculation beyond the text? I don't know if you have to spell it up, but
no, I don't promote any particular view of science. Again, I'm interested in interpreting the text, and so I'm very comfortable saying that I don't find the text incompatible with whatever theories of science, but likewise, it's not promoting any of those theories, and I'm content with that. I do the textual side of things. Let the scientists do the science side.
Indeed.
But I would find no reason to object to those models based on biblical analysis or theology.
When I talked to the Reverend I mentioned, the one thing he pointed back to me was the question of death before the fall, and I think that's going to be a stumbling block for a lot of people. But it seems like if people are willing to kind of approach this with more of an open-handed, willingness to with open-handed willingness to kind of engage with the text's authorial intent, there's opportunity to kind of loosen some of those assumptions and kind of reevaluate certain things, but with respect to what we know to be true about the scripture.
Well, in my view, the fact that humans are identified as dust indicates that they are mortal. And that's right from the start in Genesis 2. Dust is an image of mortality. And some people think, well, it can't be because Paul says differently. But Paul just says we're subject to death because of sin. That's not the same thing as saying we were immortal before sin. It says we're subject to death because of sin. And that's because when people sinned, they were kicked out of the garden and blocked from access to the tree of life. And without the tree of life, mortal people have only their mortality. So, Paul knows that immortal people wouldn't need a tree of life. So I think that this idea that prior to the fall, there was no death of any sort is a flawed interpretation, and it's not something that has been carried throughout the history of interpretation in the church. There's been mixed reports on that as well. But again, that's only anecdotally with the various church fathers and what they had to say. So others have accepted immortality before the fall, but there's no biblical reason to do so. And again, the reviews are mixed in church history.
Well, there you go. You said you had a new book that's out recently. Is there anything else you want to promote before we close up real quick?
Well, again, the Lost World series now is ready to move into book 7. Lost World of the Prophets is coming out in 2024. And so The Lost World series has been of interest to lots of people. But again, when you want to get back to the hermeneutical questions and the methodology that I use, the Wisdom for Faithful Reading would be the place to go. I've tried to really put everything in an accessible and understandable way as I talk about how we interpret Old Testament. So those would be things that I would recommend.
Well, there you go. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time today.
Okay, Tyler, good to talk to you.
You too. Have a good day. The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions and cultural review podcast. Editing, hosting, and producing are by Tyler Hummel, art by Crystal Cowley, and original music is composed by Guap Squad Gang and Melissa Lafira. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below and tell us anyone you think would be a good guest for the show. Thank you for listening.